did it change anyone's opinion or belief? That argument, one way or another.
I think one thing they sort of said was it just encourages them to think about it a bit more.
Yeah, for sure.
We're trying to paint a picture of, rather than God as being a man in the sky with a beard, as something else. And another thing that I picked up talking to them was that lots of people believe in something, but they're reluctant to use the word God.
Sure. Yeah.
For you can imagine reasons why.
Yeah. So, what we'll do today, well, hopefully, is we'll look at, just review the Kalam argument, a few of the terms that you've looked at, and then we'll look at this fellow called Thomas Aquinas, and he was quite famous for, in history, 13th century, for proving God's existence. He's known for the 5 ways, what are known as the 5 ways. And we'll look at 2 of them in particular, the argument from motion and the argument from contingency. And one of them's fairly similar to the Kalam argument, but there is a bit of a tweak, so it's slightly different. So, does anyone remember the Kalam? So we'll start off with the review of the Kalam argument. Does anyone know the Kalam argument? There are 3 main moves in it.
Everything has a cause.
Very good.
The universe is something, so the universe must have a cause.
Very good.
What's the second part?
So the first part is everything has a cause. The second part is that premise 1. The universe is a thing, therefore the universe has a cause. So it's a Islamic art. This guy, I forget his name. He was Islamic fellow. But he picks it up from Aristotle, and this fellow called Aristotle in ancient Greece was a main proponent, and he was used very much in the Middle Ages and even today for proving God's existence. A lot of his principles. So it's based upon Aristotle's understanding of the prime mover, the unmoved mover, and it's the temporal ordering of events is central, and it presupposes, these are big words, but I'll try and explain them, metaphysical impossibility of actual infinities. So in maths, we can think of infinities conceptually, but in the world, you can't. So there's a distinction between what we can think of in our mind and in reality itself. So the argument is, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and some people would call that God. Who agrees with that?
I think that's sort of what we had as stage 1, and most people were pretty happy with stage 1 of the argument. Like, the universe has a cause, and then when we talked about it, we had stage 2, introducing God as the cause. For God.
Okay.
But most people are pretty happy with stage 1, I think.
Yep. So that everything has a cause.
Yep.
Now just keep that in the back of your mind, because when we come to the argument of motion from Aquinas, it's similar, but Aquinas disagrees with this. He disagrees in particular with this, the metaphysical impossibility of actual infinities. How do we know that? How do we know that you can't actually have an infinite number of causes? Why can't it just go back in time forever? So even though the Earth began to exist, doesn't mean the causes behind it weren't infinite. Can you see that? So we'll come and look at that in a moment. So this is kind of a bit of a review of what we looked at. Now, recapitulation of terms. So simple means, so we use simple in a few different ways. So simple, sometimes we can use it in derogatory sense. If we say someone's simple, there's not much nuance to their character. They're fairly basic. But this is not what simple means. Simple, in a philosophical sense, it means not containing any parts. It's not a composite. Are we simple in that manner then? No. Why not? We contain parts, exactly. Immateriality, so it's not material, lacks matter. Now, immaterial things imply cognition. The more immaterial something is, the more it approaches infinity. So, Why does immateriality imply cognition?
Because it's made up, wasn't it? It's thought of, and you can't actually see what it is.
Exactly. Yes. Yep. So, are we partly immaterial? Do you think? Yes, because we can cognize, we can think, and a good example is abstraction. So I can look at all of you, and I can think of the number 13 because there are 13 of you. Like a good example is numbers, that we have the capacity to abstract. But there is no such thing as 13 that has matter. I can't point at something and say, oh, that's 13. Does that make sense? You abstract out of experience, you kind of pull a concept out, and we can all agree on it in a certain sense. That, you know, when I say there are 14 people in this room, you understand what I'm saying. But I can't point, that's 14, you know, that's 14 people to an actual material thing, can I? And that's kind of an argument for what we call the soul in traditional kind of philosophy, that we have souls because we can cognize. So that's immaterial. Eternal, so the whole and simultaneous possession of endless life. So what that means is that it's not in time. Now, the hard thing we find with eternal is like, okay, if God created the world, what was before God? Like, that's a common rebuttal. It's like, well, that's actually misunderstanding what him being the cause means, because in our minds, from our perspective, we're thinking in time, because we exist in space and time. And it's that kind of, sorry, what's it, Jacob, is it?
Yes.
It's, you know, the comment you made about a virtual, it's the world we live in, everything there is. Like, is there a virtuality around us? It's similar to that kind of point that, from our perspective, that's the kind of question we'd ask, because we exist in space and time. Well, what was before that? Where it's, like, that question doesn't make sense, because there is no before actual time begins to exist. And it's hard for us to conceptualize because we exist in time. Does that make sense? So that's kind of eternal. So it's not what happened before time. Well, it's not like a point before time, it's outside of it. Omnipotent, so this is, and note these are all characteristics of God, or the first cause of existence from the Kalam argument. These are characteristics that would be applicable. So is God, do we know what omnipotent means?
All powerful.
All powerful. Is God all powerful? Yeah. So a common argument against it is that can he create a rock that he can't lift if he's all powerful?
Campbell and Vinny had a good one as well. What was the same sort of thing? Can God create another God?
Oh, that's right, yeah. So if he's all-powerful, he should be able to create another god, or like duplicate himself that is also all-powerful.
Yep.
But then they can't both be all-powerful, because one of them has to have...
Yeah, exactly.
Power.
Yeah. Very good point. What do people think? So does that mean he's not powerful if he can't do that? So it goes to the understanding, what does all-powerful mean? So he can do all things that are possible absolutely. So if we say someone's all-powerful, they can do anything. Now, say, can he square a circle? That's not a thing. So he can't contradict himself, because reason is a part of who he is. So being all-powerful doesn't mean absolute possibility, self-contradiction. Does that make sense? So he can't square a circle. He can't create another being that's also God, because they're not actually possible. So all-powerful means he can do all things that are possible absolutely. Whatever implies contradiction does not come in with the scope of divine omnipotence, because it cannot have the aspect of possibility. Does that make sense? Kind of.
So what about could he make 2 + 2 = 5?
What do people think? No. Why?
Sorry, I was going to ask you a question.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So, because God has to act within reason, does that mean he's bound by some sort of like rule or law that's outside of him?
It's a good question. That's part of who he is. He is reason. So it's the foundation of who he is.
Yeah.
He like logos. He is logos. Yep.
So does that mean that those laws of reason started when he created the universe? Because those laws only came into play once there was these boundaries that can be brought up.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a good question. So yes, well they came into play in the way we understand them at creation. But before, from all eternity, remembering eternity means outside of all of that, we only have access to that if God reveals it to us, because we're coming from our point of departure is within space and time. Does that make sense? Yeah, so God is all-powerful, which means he can do anything, but then what is a square circle isn't a thing. So he can do all things that are possible, absolutely. So that importance of possibility is, it's not possible. Why? Because it's not rational, and God is rational. He can't contradict himself, for example. Omniscient. What does omniscient mean? All-knowing. Yep. So, omni means all, and scientia. What kind of words do we have similar to scientia today? Science. So science originally didn't just mean maths, physics, chemistry. It means knowledge generally. So he's all-knowing. Now, Aristotle so God is all-knowing, but this is a bit of a side comment. The soul is in a sense all things, and that goes back to our capacity to abstract. So we can think of different things, can't we? At one moment I can think of a dog, another moment I can think of a tree, and I can conceptualize that in my mind of what that is. And I have that capacity to be all things in a conceptual manner because I'm immaterial, partly. Does that make sense? And omnibenevolent means all good. So these are all characteristics of God, or the first cause, which we'll come to. So it's a bit of a recap of what you've looked at so far. Any questions? So we'll shift now a bit to the medieval world. So then going back to, this is now Thomas Aquinas. So what we've just looked at is a bit of a recap, the Kalam argument and some of the terms that we've used. Now we'll look to, this is the 13th century in particular. So we've got Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the most famous philosophers in history, really. But I'll try and set up a bit of the world within which he lived. So he was a Dominican priest in the 13th century. Now, from an educational point of view, the first philosophers were in ancient Greece, and they used to debate in the polis, the agora. So it was an open public forum, and where we get the word politics from is from the Greeks. Debating really came from that, and they'd hash out ideas. Then we kind of shift to the monasteries. So a lot of texts were written, and they were transcribed in monasteries in Europe in particular. So they maintained the education and knowledge throughout the early centuries. And we got the Roman Empire, which then falls in the 5th century. So the monasteries kind of maintain education and knowledge through transcription. But then there's a shift to the cities. So people move out of kind of an agricultural form of life, and they move into the cities. So that's where we get the move from monasteries to cathedral schools, which becomes the basis for universities. So the Catholic Church founded universities, So 11th century, Pope Gregory VII established cathedral schools, which then were the basis for the first, they argue with dates, and what was the first? The University of Bologna in 1088 was kind of the first. Then you get Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, and all these other more famous ones. Similarly, founded hospitals in Rome. There was an improved economy. So this is one of the kind of good aspects of the Crusades. It led to the redistribution of wealth. So when they went to the Holy Land, they formed new trade routes, they formed guilds, creation of modern lending institutions, and there was kind of a redistribution of wealth among more people. And the church also had care for the poor. So governments tried to ban poor people from the public. The church protected them from court fees and provided food, shelter, and arms. So this was the medieval world. We've got the formation of universities from an educational point of view, and that's what we're focusing on. And it's this what's known as the scholastic period. So schole means leisure, which becomes our word school. So school is a place of leisure in the sense that it gives us, well, arguably, the idea of leisure is that you've got the freedom to engage. Well, the fact that we can engage in these kinds of questions implies leisure, that we're not bound to till the ground, to be farmers, to work all day for our sustenance. We've got the freedom, a capacity to engage with different questions, and you need leisure for that. You need to not be engaged with physical labor the whole time. So schole, leisure. Then this is the scholastic period, and it's particularly shaped by the link between faith and reason. So what we can know by reason and what we can know by faith. And a big figure that is rediscovered is Aristotle. So Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher, about 400 BC, 300 BC, and his works were rediscovered, and they were pumped into the university system. Now, a lot of the university system, the way it worked was you had kind of a teacher, and you'd be given a topic, and the way it worked is, say, I don't know, the topic was, does God exist? The way it worked was the students would prepare questions and fire them at the teacher. And then the written works, they're a bit hard to read because it's kind of question, objection, response, what I think. And a lot of those objections were questions which students asked. So that's how the university system really, and it's got, our form of, so it wasn't just lecture, like it wasn't like what I'm doing now. Partly what we're trying to kind of do at the moment is do what they did. So that's why I'm trying to draw questions out of you, and because that provokes thinking, questioning, and a few of you mentioned to begin with, you like philosophy because you can question. And that's how the university really started in the Middle Ages. There was one person who was kind of supposed to be a bit more, read up on the topic, and then questions were fired, and there'd, be discussions around. So that's how the universities started. And you read some of for example, Thomas Aquinas, his most famous book was the Summa Theologiae, and the way you read it's like there's a question and there's three objections to the question. So does God exist, for example, could be a question, and then it'd be like, I object for these reasons, A, B, C. Then he would have his response, and then his responses to the individual objections. And that form of written response was an articulation of what actually happened in the universities. So that's how they were structured. So it's back and forth. So this is Thomas Aquinas, born in Roccasecca, which is in Italy. He joins the Dominican order. Most famous work is the Summa Theologiae, which is quite a dense book. And from that, we're going to get the 5 ways. So I'll go through a few principles that he bases his argument upon. So all his 5 ways are what's called cosmological arguments. What do you think that means? What's the cosmos?
Like
What, the universe?
The universe, yeah, exactly. So the way he tries to prove God's existence is through experience looking at the universe. Some other ways, in contrast to a cosmological argument, could be like more of a mental one. So just conceptually thinking in my mind, through propositions. A big proponent of that was Saint Anselm, who was just before Thomas Aquinas. His argument, which is quite interesting in itself, is he says, God is that the which no greater thought can be thought. That's what God is by definition. And he says, if it's the greatest thing that can be thought, it should have existence to it. Because what's better than non-existence is existence. Therefore, God exists. So that's an example of a non-cosmological argument, that it's just in his mind, that he's working from propositions and definitions. Whereas Aquinas goes from the world as he sees it. So it's all through sensation, what we sense. So you've looked at act and potency, have you? Yeah. What's the difference?
So act is actuality, which is what it actually is in the world, and potency is potentiality, so what it potentially could be.
Yeah, very good. And that's shaped by who we are as well. So I'm actually standing here and potentially standing there, and I can actualize that potentiality by moving here. Does that make sense? Now, I was actually born in Poland. Can I actually be born in Australia? No, because act and potency is shaped by who I am, by nature. And that goes back to that thing about God being omnipotent. It's shaped by who he is. He's not illogical, if that makes sense. So act and potency. Now the 5 ways, so there are 5 arguments. These are the 5 arguments. First argument is the argument from motion. Second, from causation, or efficient causality. Third, from contingency. Fourth, from degree. Fifth, from teleology or ends. So I'll just quickly run through what each of those mean, like how he does it. So the first argument, he kind of says that things in the world change. Things cannot change themselves, they must be changed. So motion means change changed by another. This cannot go to infinity, but must have a first cause. And that's what we call God. So similar to the Kalam, the causation one is similar as well. The argument from contingency is that there are some things that didn't have to be. So that question of why is there something rather than nothing? So we know that some things didn't come into being, go out of being. Therefore, they didn't have to exist by necessity. Think of your own experience. The kind of the high improbability that we exist. You think of your parents, like imagine if they never met, if their parents never met, it's highly improbable that each of us exists, and yet we do. And we could have not been, if that makes sense. So that means, that's what contingent means. That we didn't have to exist by necessity. If we didn't exist, not much, the world would still be going around, wouldn't it? But if we could not have existed, there was a time when we didn't exist. So before we were born, for example, we didn't exist. Now, everything, you can't have everything that way, because then nothing would exist. If everything is contingent, there was a time when nothing existed. But we do know things exist. Therefore, there's got to be one necessary being we call God. I'll go into a bit more depth on these two in particular. The argument for degree is that there are different degrees of things in life, and there's got to be a measure to judge the difference between degrees, and that measure is what we call God. Obviously, it's a bit more complex and you can pick it up, but I'm just giving you the general trend of each of these. the argument from teleology, everything tends towards something, and that end ultimately is what we call God. So, the one from motion, so Kalam versus Thomas. So, the Kalam argument believes that metaphysical impossibility of actual infinities, whereas Thomas would say impossibility of causally ordered infinite regress. So the difference is Kalam argues kind of back in time. It's chronological. So, and that's why you can critique that and say, well, what about before? Whereas Thomas is more vertical, it's depth. So it's a relationship of dependency rather than chronology. So that's a difference there, vertical versus horizontal. And as also Thomas says, past and future are potential, and therefore there are infinite number of midway points between any two given points is possible. Does that make sense? Yeah. So they're his critiques of the Kalam argument. So this is the main. This is his argument from motion. This is probably my favourite argument for God's existence. So, first premise: things change in the world. We open our eyes. A seed grows into a flower. We grow physically. We move from place to place. There's movement. There's growth. There's change. We age. Things. People are born. People die. So that's the first thing. He opens and that's why it's cosmological. He opens his eyes, he looks at the world, the universe, and realizes things change. That's the first point. Second point, well, what is change? Change is a movement from potency to act. So, like I said, I'm potentially over there. Now I'm actually there. There was a change. And the change, what is change? Change is always movement from something in potentiality to actuality. Everyone with me? Now, things cannot change except by something in actuality. So, what does that mean? So, something cannot change we cannot change it except by something in actuality. I am actually real, therefore I can change certain aspects that are potential. And the reason that point is true is because how would you know, determine at any given point whether something can be in potentiality and actuality at the same time? What determines at a given instant whether you can have two things, because you can't have two things in actuality and potentiality in the same way in the same respect, because that would imply contradiction. This regression cannot go into infinity since it is a relationship of dependence, not chronology. So, my hand is here, it's potentially up here. There's change there, that's the first point. This changes the movement from potency to act. Now, it cannot change except by something in actuality, and this regression can't go to infinity. So my hand is dependent upon my arm, dependent upon my torso, dependent upon so many chemical structure going down subatomic particles and so on, the state of the universe. Now that's all happening in one instant. And this is the point, that it's one of dependency. It's not going back in time. It's all in that moment. And you can't go back to infinity. You can't go down into infinity, rather, because there'd be no subsequent movers. Now, because if I didn't have a torso, there would be no arm. Well, there could be an arm, but it wouldn't have the capacity to move. You take one link out of the chain and it falls apart. And it can't go to infinity because it's all in an instant. And you can't fit infinity into a finite moment in that regard. Therefore, there's got to be one base first mover we call God. Any comments?
It's like the projector just went off. You might just need to hit the. Or just wait for a sec till it stops flashing, and then yeah.
Any questions? Do you agree with that? So it's slightly different from the Kalam argument because, like I said, it's not chronology back in time. Because, say, a good example of a chronological argument is, begetting children. So, my parents begot me, that their parents begot them, and so on and so on. And it's not impossible to not imagine that could go on forever. Why couldn't it go on forever? That's what, whereas this argument is slightly different because it's one of dependence. It's not back in time. It's kind of vertical independence because it's all in an instant.
Yeah, I think if you try press the green one when it's flashing, it sort of stuffs up a bit.
Oh, does it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it'll probably just take 30 seconds. I don't know why it turned off.
Any comments in regard to that argument? Are you convinced?
I've heard the analogy of the chandelier hanging. Do you want to describe that one?
Yeah. So think of a chandelier hanging, and you got a chandelier dependent upon a chain, a link of chains dependent upon the structure of the ceiling, which is dependent upon the walls, the base, the structure, and that's all in that instant, right? We're not going back in time, are we? The chandelier is dependent upon all these things for it to, and you take a wall, you take one of the links in that chain out, or you take out a wall, you knock down the wall, the thing collapses. The chandelier no longer hangs. And Thomas would see kind of the whole universe in that manner, that there are so many kind of interlinking dependencies in an instant for God to exist. That's why his argument for the existence of God is of a being not like deists think that the clockmaker that just created the world and let it unfold. It's at each moment that there's a dependence from moment to moment. So, chandelier or projector, for example. The fact that sounds funny, but it's true. The fact that projector is hanging there now is a proof that God exists, according to this argument. Now, I've given you the argument from motion, but this guy called Bishop Barron, he does a better job than me, so I'll let him.
What about, I just have one question. If change is the movement from actuality to potentiality, it's the actualization of potential. That doesn't that occur over a period of time rather than at an instant?
That's a good question. Any thoughts? I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, just pop it in my
Yeah.
Well, one of the unintended, but I think happy consequences of the new atheism is a renewed interest in the classical arguments for God's existence. So a lot of Catholic evangelists and apologists, eager to stave off the new atheist critiques, have recovered these rational demonstrations. And the atheists, eager to defend their position, have entered the fray. And I think in the process, these arguments have found a new relevance, and actually in the give and take of both advocates and critics have been refined. So I want to revisit Thomas Aquinas, famously gave us 5 arguments for God's existence, but he said there is one that is the first and more manifest way, the argument from motion. I can lay it out very simply and schematically. Things move, nothing moves itself. There can be no infinite regress of moved movers. And so there must be some first unmoved mover, and this all people call God. So that's the argument. You lay it out very simply that way. But now let's examine it a bit to avoid some of the misunderstandings that have happened over the centuries. I mean, from the Middle Ages till today, that argument has been seriously misconstrued. First of all, the word that Thomas uses is motus in Latin. And you can render that as motion in English, but motus has more the sense of change. Not just change of place, what we call motions, the motion of my hand, but it means any kind of change. So someone growing in knowledge, someone learning a language, being born and dying. And all these are forms of motus in Thomas's sense. Motus he characterizes as the transition of something from potency to act, from potential reality to actual reality. And once we see that, we see why his second principle holds that nothing can move itself. If you're undergoing motion, you're in the state of potentiality. Think of someone now who's learning French, right? He doesn't know French. He's potentially in possession of French, but he's undergoing the transition. But the cause of motion must be an act. So the one who's teaching French must know the language and thereby moves the student to actualization. What follows is no one can be both mover and moved at the same time in the same respect. You don't, strictly speaking, teach yourself French. I mean, you might pick up a book on your own, but that means the book is teaching you French. I mean, the guy that wrote the book was in possession of French, etc. So in the strict sense, nothing reduces itself from potency to act. There's no self-moved reality. So let's suppose something is in motion. It's changing. We therefore know it's being changed by another, by some extrinsic cause. Let's suppose now that that extrinsic cause is itself being moved or being changed. Think, for example, of this stole being moved by my hand, which is here and now being moved by muscles in my arm, which are being stimulated by nerves, which are now grounded in the brain, etc. If that which causes the motion is itself being put in motion, it must be put in motion by something extrinsic to itself, and that by another again, that by another again. That process cannot go on indefinitely. Why? Because if I suppress the first element in that chain, then there's no subsequent movers. If there are no subsequent movers, there's no motion. But the motion I can see right before me with my own eyes. Therefore, there has to be, Aquinas concludes, some first element, a first unmoved mover, a first unenergized energizer, a first unactualized actualizer, to explain the actualizations taking place within the universe. There's a comment made by Bertrand Russell, the 20th century philosopher, that I always found remarkably unhelpful in this regard. As he's considering this famous argument, he says, well, the reason Thomas denied infinite series is he just couldn't imagine them because they hadn't really come into vogue until the 20th century with mathematical logic and so on and so forth. Well, nothing can be further from the truth. Thomas had no trouble whatsoever imagining infinite series. He speculated about them all the time. What he was denying was this particular type of infinite causal series, whereby each element in the chain is here and now dependent upon the one antecedent to it. In that kind of chain, the suppression of the first element would lead necessarily to the suppression of the subsequent elements, and therefore of that change which we can see here and now. So the conclusion is there must exist this first, call it unactualized actualizer. And then the little tagline at the end, this all people call God. Now, at this point, there are some agnostics and atheists who say, the argument's fine. I think the argument is logically airtight. They know that an infinite causal series violates the principle of sufficient explanation. And if you say, it just goes back indefinitely, well, you haven't explained anything. They understand that it's a violation of this most fundamental law of science, that you've got to find a sufficient explanation. But they will balk at that little tagline at the end, and this all people call God. What they'll say, especially today, look, there might be a first mover, okay, an unactualized actualizer, but it's just matter itself, or it's energy. Often they'll point to the law of the conservation of energy, that energy never really comes into being or passes away, it just assumes different forms forever and ever. So the fundamental stuff, if you want, the unmoved mover, is energy. Well, here's the problem. See, if you follow Thomas's argument, the conclusion you come to is this reality, which provides actualization, but is itself not actualized. It is therefore actus purus. It means pure act. Actus translates into Latin energeia in the Greek. I love that. It's a term that Aristotle used a lot. Energy, energy. The real first mover, if you've really come to this reality, you found that thing which is utterly energized in its being. That means realized in its being. And can, in principle, receive no outside influence, because it's the first element in this causal chain. Matter or energy cannot be this reality. Why? Because matter, or to use like a more contemporary term, energy, is by its very nature infinitely malleable. Matter exists in this particular configuration. It could be in 1,000 different configurations. If you say matter, you mean something of a particular color, shape, size, location, velocity. You say energy, you mean, well, energy in what form, what configuration, at what quantum level, right? Matter or energy are potential, to use the classical philosophical language. They have a certain actuality, but they're marked by an extraordinary potentiality. And now, do a little thought experiment. I've been hinting at it already. Imagine something, some existing thing. So this stole, or one of these books on the bookshelf. There is matter in a particular configuration, but it could be in a million other configurations. Therefore, we're compelled to ask, and see, it lies behind all of science. We're compelled to ask, well, what put it in that particular form? Now I begin looking for extrinsic causes. Well, I say, well, sure, the publisher put the matter in that particular form, colored it that particular way. Fine, fine. It could be 1,000 other forms, but it's in that form because of an extrinsic cause. A mover, if you want. Now, is that cause itself potential? Was it put in that form by another cause? Well, yeah, you say, sure, it was. That process cannot go on infinitely. Otherwise, we've explained nothing. If we simply appeal indefinitely to material causes, we haven't solved our problem, because matter remains essentially potential. But the unmoved mover is actus purus. See, now you understand why Thomas can say, this all people call God. Once you understand the nature of the real unmoved mover, who is utterly realized in his being, who's completely energized in his existence, that which experiences no ontological restriction whatsoever. Actus purus is that which exists through the power of its own essence. What's God's name in the book of Exodus? What's your name? I am who I am. Do you see now why Aquinas, borrowing this, of course, from Aristotle, but can very reasonably make the correlation between actus purus, the unmoved mover, and what all people call God.
Any comments on that? So much clearer than what I tried to say. Anything that surprised you? So let's try and make the argument from motion. So what's the first premise or observation? Remembering they're all cosmological, so they're all have to do with the cosmos and how we perceive the world, implying our senses, that we sense something in the world. What do we sense?
Starts with CH.
Change. Yeah. So things in the world change. We sense change. What is change?
Something moving from potentiality to actuality.
Very good, yep. So change is a movement from potentiality to actuality. Number 3.
Or is it something in its actual form caused the actuality of that?
Yep. So not yet. So something. So point 2 was movement from potentiality to actuality. Only something in actuality can cause change. Something real can cause change. Point 4.
Cannot carry on for infinity.
Yep. Therefore, yep. Point 5.
Unmoved move.
Yep. Very good. So we've all proved God's existence. So that's things in the world change. Change is movement from potentiality to actuality. Something actual, only something in actuality can cause a change from potentiality to actuality. This cannot go into back into affinity. Therefore, there must be a first cause we call God. And Bishop Barron made the point that's pure act. That there can't be any potentiality in that, because then you beg the question of, well, something can cause that thing in actuality to change because it's got potentiality. Can you see that? Takes a bit of time to really kind of wrap your head around it, but yeah. And I was thinking about the time question, that time, and I think time, and it goes back to the comment that I was making before, that we think from the perspective of time. I think time itself is change. That change encapsulates time, because you beg the question, what is time?
Right.
And this is kind of moment to moment. So I don't think that the movement from potentiality to actuality is encapsulated by time. I think time is encapsulated in that, because that's what time is, I think. Augustine defines time as tending towards non-existence. But time's a hard one, to work out. But I think time would be encapsulated within this argument from motion. That it's kind of, this argument isn't, like I said, it's not chronological, so it's not really dependent upon time. I think time is something that moves from potentiality to actuality. Yeah. So people convinced by that argument? Argument from motion, number 1.
So I don't know if you're going to talk about this in a sec, but when you have so we have this regressive act and potency has to end in something purely actual.
Yeah.
Why does that have to be God, or why does it have the properties of God?
That's a good question. I mean, God is just, it's interesting when you read Aquinas' arguments. It's funny, it's only like a paragraph each. And he says, this is what we call God. Now, this is kind of, and this is where definitions is quite important and quite difficult, because, now I'll try and do this thought experiment to try and, make sense of this. So, there's a distinction between what a thing is and that it is. So, a phoenix, for example. Do phoenix exists? No. So, but do we know what they are? A unicorn, do unicorns exist? No, they don't exist, but do we know what they are? So this is in the kind of classical terminology, it's essence and existence. There's a distinction. Now, and each of us have that. Because we know that we have a distinction between our essence and existence. Because we have an understanding of who we are, but it's not necessary that we exist. Our existence, the fact that we exist, is not within who we are. part of my definition, of a human person, for example, is an individual substance of rational nature. Now, that's a definition of a human person. In that definition, is existence there? No, because I can know what a person is, but from knowing what a person is, it doesn't conclude that I know that any humans exist. Just the fact that I know this definition. Does that make sense? So I can know what a thing is without knowing that it exists. Now the flip. So with God, can we know what God is? No. Can we know that he exists? And that's Thomas's argument. He says, we cannot define God, but we can know that he exists. And note earlier, then I'll ask this question. So we don't think we can define God, and yet we use these terms to kind of, that God is simple, that God is pure act, that he's eternal, he's immaterial, he's omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, yeah. But note that these are kind of all negative, well, a lot of them are negative terms. Like eternal means outside of time. We don't have a clear understanding what eternal means. All of these are kind of negative terms. So we can know what God is not. We can know that God is not material. That's what immaterial means. We can know that God is not composite. And therefore he's simple. We can know that God isn't limited in his power. Therefore he's omnipotent. These are words which kind of stammer to try and describe God, but in terms of a definition of God, it's always, remember, from our perspective. And if we could conceptualize God, then we would be God, because we'd be able to wrap our heads around him. Whereas our understanding of God is that he's beyond conceptualization, but at the same time doesn't mean that we can't know something about him. We can't define him completely, but because we believe, well, as Catholics, he's revealed himself, we can know something of him in that domain. But that he exists, we can know through philosophy. Does that make sense? So for all of these arguments, the Kalam, the argument for emotion, and the contingency one we're going through, they all finish, this is what we call God. But can you note that there's no definition? It's not like, and this is, there's no kind of definition of what God is. It's just that he exists, and he exists as, Aristotle would say the unmoved mover. That's God. That's his definition of God. But it's not really telling us much. It's only through this argument, the conclusion of the argument is God. And because all of these arguments are from effects to cause. From what we see to asking the question of how they got there. That's like the Bishop Barron made the comment about this. That's what all science really asks. This table, where did it come from? So it's starting from an effect. The effect is the table. And if I work my way down to the cause, okay, well, there's got to be a first one which we call God. Does that make sense? So we can't know what God is, but we can know that he is.
What about, I think another way I've heard it described, if all material things we're surrounded by are a mixture of act and potency, right? So you're a material thing, you've got the potentiality to be there, right? And so if we have this regress, what's the example? Does Aquinas have the example of the bowl and the stick, or even you think of the chandelier? Right? Yeah. So its potential to be there is actualized by the previous link in the chain, and they're all mixtures of act and potency. But it has to end with something that's purely actual, because if it has potentiality, then there's something that must actualize that.
Yes.
And so if we've got God as purely actual, what does that mean? it means there's no potentials.
Yes.
Right, so that means there's no potential for improvement. There's no potential for change. That means God has everything.
Yes.
So he has everything. He has all powers. So he's all powerful.
Mm.
So if you get purely actual, then you can arrive at all powerful. What does it mean to be all powerful? You're not bound by space and time. You're eternal.
Yes. Yes.
So
yeah.
So that's sort of one way of arriving.
That's I like that. That's a very good way of kind of describing it. Does that make sense to everyone? So, based upon that, Aquinas will then later on go, his definition in inverted commas is the very act of to be itself. That's what God is. So pure act. That's he tries to articulate pure actuality. It's being itself. So it undergirds all of reality. Because he's the first cause, he's the unmoved mover. Unmoved implying that there's no potentiality. Like Mr. Royals was saying, that there's pure actuality, therefore he's not moved, and remember, move means change in this kind of more classical form.
So does that mean, so every movement that you make then is caused by God?
Yes, yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you do the wrong thing, is it caused by God? Or
Well, this is it depends. Well, what is wrong? Like, wrongness or evil is always the absence of good.
Yeah.
And so evil is not I'm talking in metaphysical terms rather than the moral terms now. So evil does not exist. Yeah.
Isn't that kind of an argument against free will? As would you say, everything is caused by God?
Yeah, if God's that first actualizer and he actualizes.
Yeah, so all
change.
movements are caused by God, therefore we don't decide to make any movement.
That's a good question. What do you think? So it'd be deterministic. So that'd be a deterministic world, but determinism would imply necessity. And we know that we have potentiality. So metaphysically, it doesn't necessarily undermine free will, because you still have potentiality, implying freedom. That you can be here, but you can be there.
Can't you say that all those potentialities are caused by the first? Because it's like you know when you like whip, and there's like the wave, and it's all caused by that first movement.
Yep.
All the potential is caused by the starting movement.
Yeah. So potentiality isn't real, though. Remember.
What about like the way things can be are grounded in the way it is,
Yes.
So like the example we've talked about is the cup can be smashed into 1,000 pieces and painted red, but it can't turn into a chicken because it doesn't have that in its nature. So so God is complete act, and we're sort of limited in our potentialities are limited. But there's a choice in there at some level.
There is, yeah. And this is the difficulty. It's like you've got one extreme, complete determinism. The other extreme is complete freedom. Right. So the argument for determinism was like, well, whatever I do is already determined. I have no freedom. But that would imply that I've got no another word for potentiality is free will, really. Because there's more than one thing that I can do. The fact that I could not exist, I may not have existed, implies a freedom in a metaphysical way. So there's complete determinism, but that means that only God would exist because he's the only necessary being. There'd be no world if you're deterministic. Does that make sense? But then complete freedom is, well, that would mean that I'm God. So there's kind of this nature, freedom, existence, essence mix which we have within us. That we are shaped because we're human beings. It's like I wasn't so free that I could determine that I was a human person. Aristotle makes a point: the human person does not make the human person to be a human person. I don't determine my essence as a human person. That preceded me. Does that make sense? Like when I was conceived, my parents didn't consult me if I wanted to exist. So there's something that precedes my freedom. That's outside of my freedom. There are certain things that that I was born, where I was born, the family I was born into, all these things, so it can't be complete, absolute freedom in that sense. But then does that mean, well, that's all outside of my control, therefore I've got nothing, no freedom, that it's absolutely determined? It's like, but if we reflect upon our lives, there are choices that we've made that we know we may not have made, or we may have made other choices. And there is a tension here, isn't there? Because you think, well, and that's from our, yeah?
So there's infinite potentiality, but there's only one possible thing that you do. So couldn't you say that just because you think there's potential options, that doesn't mean there actually are, because you only do one of them?
So there isn't infinite potentiality.
Not infinite.
Yeah.
But
so there are options. Yeah.
Millions.
Options. Yeah.
But you can only do one. And couldn't you say, just because you have the thought of potential things doesn't mean it actually exists?
What doesn't exist? So you've got a series of options.
Yeah.
In a given, like say in a closed kind of example.
Yeah.
You go to the shop and you want to drink.
Yeah.
You can have orange juice, water, Gatorade.
Yeah.
So they're your options.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the potentiality. You make a choice.
Yeah. And you think you make a decision, but how do you know that was you that made the decision and not the last? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and this is that's a good question. So, fundamentally, it's God Himself that causes that. But cause meaning kind of without Him, you wouldn't be able to make a choice to begin with. And remember, we're coming from our perspective. Like God causes everything. Obviously, that needs to be nuanced. Like, well, what does that mean? Does that, a very good question, does that take away my freedom? Well, no, my freedom is within that context. Because even though He's the fundamental basis, there are still other causes. Other series of dependencies. So, for example, going back to the chandelier, God is the basis for all to hold together. So without Him, there's absolutely nothing, right? But then still, if you take one chain away, it will fall apart. So it doesn't mean everything else is irrelevant just because without Him, there's nothing. There's still relevances. Like that choice that I make still has effects. Does that make sense? It's a very good question, yeah.
And we will talk about determinism. We'll have a long study on that.
Yeah.
But maybe just to summarise, because we should wrap up soon.
Yep.
If every change is this series of actualizations has to be something purely actual, well, it could just be that God has actualized your potential for free will. And so He's actualized that, and that's where the choice comes in. You're still making a choice, but it's like for you to go to the shop and choose the cereal box or the drink you're going to get. That's only actualized by someone opening the door, or the door's opening for you. If they're locked, that can't be actualized, and so that so God could be as such unlocking those doors that allow you to make the choice. Rather than Him making the choice for you as such.
And I think it's like from God's perspective, if He is eternal, He sees all of this because He's outside time. He sees all of it at the same moment, which I think comes into your question. Well, but the fact that He sees it doesn't mean that He determines it, because He's outside time. He's present every, there's a good kind of, whose centre is everywhere and circumference nowhere. If you think of that as being a description of kind of God from this perspective. His centre is everywhere, circumference nowhere. But doesn't mean he determines what you do. He shapes it, he shapes our freedom, like I said by the examples I gave, by when I was that I exist, and who I was born to, where I was born, all these things are shape my freedom. And God sees all of that, but it doesn't mean that he determines it necessarily. There's, within that, our freedom is, what exists. All good? Yeah, I might leave the third actually.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. We'll wrap up. So guys, please thank Father Rob. And what we'll do is we'll set the room back up as it was, and then you guys can cruise to your next lesson. So,
thanks, guys.
Yeah. Stop. Camcorder.